The 8th of September 1923, 14 ships of the U.S. Navy, beautiful new Clemson-class destroyers, steamed out of San Francisco Harbor. A time before the massive red trusses of the Golden Gate Bridge spanned the seaway. This mighty cavalry of the sea came to port and started charging hard southwards. These vessels were the newest and latest ships to be built after the Great War, and for the first time in years, it was their chance to really shake things out and show what these young ships could do. A chance to be recognized and revered. Yet for more than half this squadron of nimble warfighters, this would be their last hurrah. The vessels that made up Destroyer Squadron 11, or DesRon 11, were 14 of the latest Clemson-class destroyers that were built improving upon the previous Wickes-class destroyer, using lessons learned by previous iterations during the Great War. The vessels were state-of-the-art, with 156 being built between 1918 and 1922. They would go on to serve in several different Allied navies all the way up until after World War II in 1948. Weighing in at just over 1,300 tons combat load, the ships were long and narrow, 314 feet long and 30 feet at the beam, with 4 steam boilers and 2 geared steam turbines. The ship generated an impressive 27,000 horsepower that propelled her 2 twin shafts and brought her up to speeds of 35 knots. The nimble four-stackers, as Navy men often call them, were armed to the teeth with 4 4-inch guns, a 3-inch AA mount, and 12 21-inch torpedo tubes, meaning these fast attack ships had a heck of a bite. They carried a complement of 124 men, but it should be noted that every ship in DesRon 11 was operating at a depleted capacity. The previous naval fiscal years after the Great War forcing several elements to be downsized. The few years after their commissioning, the destroyers were kept on a tight lead. Fiscal plans had prevented the tin cans from using ample power, requiring a more economical cruising speed to be maintained. But on this 8th day of September, those leads were let loose. The horses were now free to run. A power trial was ordered for the squadron. A 20-knot speed run down the California coast from San Francisco to San Diego at best speed, simply to iron out the kinks and see what the ships could do. At the command of DesRon 11 was Captain Edward H. Watson, a 27-year Navy man, a man who had graduated the academy in 1895 and had served during the Spanish-American War, the Philippines Insurrection, and the Great War. He was Commodore of the fleet aboard his flagship USS Delphi, DD-261. Abaft his beam and following his formation stood the remaining ships of DesRon 11, organized into 3 columns or destroyer divisions. DesDiv 33 was composed of the USS SP Lee, DD-310, acting as flagship, over the USS Young, DD-312, USS Woodbury, DD-309, and USS Nicholas, DD-311. Next was DesDiv 31, flagship by the USS Farragut, DD-300, followed closely by the USS Fuller, DD-297, USS Percival, DD-298, USS Summers, DD-301, and the USS Chauncey, DD-296. Lastly was DevDiv 32, which was flagship by the USS Kennedy, DD-306, and was followed like a metal mama duck by her sister ships in the USS Paul Hamilton, DD-307, USS Stoddard, DD-302, and USS Thompson, DD-305. In this upcoming transit, all but the ships in DesDiv 32 would suffer losses. The mission was largely going to plan. The ship steamed south at a good clip of 20 knots and participated in drills and gunnery exercises. On occasion, one would fall back due to an engineering casualty, but nothing too grave occurred. The ships quickly enacted repairs and hurried to catch up to their squadron mates. In a bit of foreshadowing, the squadron did catch word of a steamship, the SS Cuba, which ran aground on San Miguel to their south. The island was one of the Santa Barbara Channel Islands, a location the fleet would be passing by. One of the divisions offered to break off and provide assistance, but Commodore Watson stubbornly declined, not wanting to sacrifice his power trial for a situation they would likely arrive too late to assist. During the transit, the vessels were also performing a navigational drill. The ships were traveling with the tried-and-true method of dead reckoning, but were also aided by a new bit of technology called radio direction finding. The system was newly in place and utilized a series of stations on shore that worked in tandem with ships to provide them with a single LOB, which assisted them in finding their location. The system was new and had a few minor flaws, but was extremely helpful to those operating in poor visibility, something that slowly crept up on the ships of DesRon 11 as they steamed south. Entering the night of the 9th, the ships began to encounter some poor weather conditions. The fog slowly socked them in on all sides. Also, a building's stern sea was making steerage slightly more difficult. Several tense hours had been spent in the chart rooms and ward rooms of the many vessels, poring over charts and plotting dead reckoning fixes. But as they were cross-referenced with the radio direction finding fixes, glaring disparities were revealed. The navigators aboard believed themselves too far south and to a good distance from the coast, but RDF held them farther north and more inland. It ultimately came down to Captain Watson, whom, less trusting of the new technology, decided it was in error. He believed that the divisions were too far south, and in danger of running upon San Miguel Island in a similar fashion to the SS Cuba. At 2100, he ordered the ships into a turn to port at 095 degrees, bringing them due east and closer to shore. The ships traveled in a tight formation. Standard operating procedure at the time had the destroyers traveling in columns, with around 250 yards from foremast to foremast. Traveling at 20 knots meant each vessel traveled 11 yards per second. The vessels could distance that gap of 250 yards in just over a third of a minute. This became quite an issue less than 5 minutes after the USS Delphi made her turn to port, and all but DesDiv 32 followed like metal ducklings. The resulting incident took mere seconds to transpire. First to hit was not in fact the USS Delphi, but in fact it was the USS Young. All aboard felt a sudden lurching, as if the ship was rising out of the water, before she was unceremoniously dropped back into the foaming sea. The captain quickly realized his ship had struck a submerged reef. Indeed it had, and a massive gouge had been shorn in her starboard side. Seawater began to pour inside as the ship changed its lights to indicate it was dead in the water. Slowly peeling to starboard, the vessel would fully lay upon its side at a 90-degree angle as the captain ordered all hands topside. The ship came to rest on a reef within 90 seconds. Sailors were either spilled overboard or were trapped, valiantly manning the boilers to extinguish her fires and prevent a deadly boiler explosion. Their sacrifice would save many of the crew of the Young, those of which now clung to the side of their dying destroyer. A fast-acting bosun mate had beat on her portholes with an axe to allow her crew handholds to cling to, despite being ringed with broken glass. The Delphi steamed on into the jaws of the shore, not knowing that just abaft her starboard beam, one of her charges had just been crippled and was in the process of sinking. Sailing into a thick fog, the crew heard a whisper below the hull as it glided onto some light gravel before the lot were thrown forward with a heavy crash. The light destroyer plunging headlong into a spire of large volcanic rocks. The crew immediately jumped into action as the captain changed his lights to red and let the sirens wail. But at 20 knots, traveling 11 yards a second, there wasn't enough time. The next vessels were nearly simultaneous in their deaths. The USS SP Lee saw the Delphi shudder and heard her wailing siren. In a panic, the captain figured the ship had run aground upon the northern tip of San Miguel. In fact, most of the captains had reached that conclusion. Thinking there must be safer water to port, he ordered his ship hard to port, hoping for safer water. Instead, he found only more coastline. His ship grounded as well. Following just behind, the Nicholas too would meet this same fate. Having seen the formation falling apart before her, the captain ordered a hard move to port, but in doing so her propeller struck bottom. Quickly losing propulsion, she washed ashore next to the lee. The USS Woodbury had been following in behind the Young and watched the ship shudder and its lights die. Ordering evasive maneuvers to avoid collision with the capsizing Young, the Woodbury came to starboard, as well hit submerged rocks before running up on a large detached rock that would that day on be known as Woodbury Rock. Following well behind was the USS Farragut, which had a very near brush with death. Seeing the Young strike and slowly capsize, the Farragut slowed down. Upon seeing the severity of the situation, the ship gave an all-back emergency speed order. This unfortunately killed her engines and generators. Cast into pitch darkness, the USS Fuller was quickly approaching. It didn't see the flagship until it was too late. Aground ships at her bow and high-speed destroyers streaking in like comets at her stern, the Farragut was struck amidship by the Fuller, who glanced off and ran aground near the Woodbury. But due to luck or some other fashion, the Farragut was able to limp away and anchor, not joining her sisters on the rocks. The Somers had a very similar experience, her propeller getting damaged on the bottom, but was still able to limp out of the rocky jaws of death that had swallowed so far 6 of her squadron mates. The Chauncey was the last to hit. the well-meaning destroyer attempting to get close to the foundering Young in an attempt to extricate her crew aboard the stricken vessel. In doing so, she passed too close to the still-spinning propeller blades of the rolled-over USS Young, cutting large gouges in her side. The inrush of water killed her engines and sent her in a final dying voyage up onto the beach. Slowly, the wails of the sirens and the screams of sailors died out, and were replaced by the steady drum beats of waves on rocks and the scraping of metal hulls against igneous rock and gravel bottoms. Now, as the fog clung close to the hulls of the once mighty cavalry of the sea, came the none too simple task of getting off the ships and safely ashore to San Miguel. But unbeknownst to the sailors, they had been heard and spotted by a man ashore, a John Gyorvis, a railroad section leader for the nearby railroad line. The ships hadn't run aground on the Santa Barbara Channel Islands. They were much farther north, on an area of the California coast known as Honda Point, or as the locals call it, the Devil's Jaw. The crews had not overshot their turn, but had undershot it by an enormous margin. But how? To understand this, one must look at the concurrent world event that happened just a few days prior. Tokyo, Japan, the 1st of September 1923. The islands were rocked by a massive earthquake. The event would be an almost 4-minute-long 8.0 magnitude earthquake that caused fire tornadoes and ended up taking the lives of over 100,000 Japanese citizens. Oddly enough, it also destroyed the yet uncompleted battlecruiser IGN Amagi and forced the Japanese to convert their sister ship Kaga from a battlecruiser to an aircraft carrier, something that affected the tide of war some 20 years later. But affecting the tides and currents is exactly what happened along the US coast near California. Tidal ranges and currents were affected by the earthquake in such a way that the fleet was subject to a heavy stern sea, and unfelt currents carried the ships of DesRon 11 in closer to shore. And while a stern sea may help carry a ship forward, these vessels determined their speed by counting propeller rotations. Speed being a vital part of the dead reckoning formula. If your speed is off, your navigation is wrong. Each time a destroyer was pitched forward on a wave, her propeller was pitched high, sometimes almost out of the water. This would cause cavitation under the hull and cause the shaft RPM to increase without the added effect of driving the ship forward faster. The cumulative effect being that the instruments indicating the ships were traveling faster than they actually were. Coupled with the current carrying them closer to shore spelled an unforeseeable disaster. Or was it? All of these things could not have been easily factored in except for the fact that the entire time the navigators knew they were off course, due to the directions given by the RDF stations that showed they were off course. Had they heeded their warnings, or at the very least slowed down to do a sounding, they would have realized they were off course. Now as the men slowly extricated themselves, with no small effort, from the battered ships to the rocky cliff-covered shores, only then was their error realized. It took some time for the men to get ashore, and even longer to climb the sharp volcanic rock-covered cliff sides. By the time they had done so, John Gyorvis had returned to the section house and called for rescue on his landline telephone. Captain Watson was astounded to hear the sound of an approaching train as he crested the cliff, and only then did he realize just how off course he had led DesRon 11. 5 vessels had their crews make their way from ship to shore. The crew of the Woodbury and Fuller were forced to stay the night atop Woodbury Rock, before being saved in the morning by a fishing ship. Gallant efforts were made by many in spanning the surf-crashing sea between ship and shore. In total, 20 men were killed or lost aboard USS Young, 3 of which were aboard a life raft. This raft was held close to another raft from the Young, which carried 5. Floating together, the group spotted a lighthouse and shore as they drifted through the fog. But only one paddle was to be had between the 2 rafts, and despite Herculean effort by one man with the paddle, no headway could be made against the powerful surf. In a show of bravery and sacrifice, the 3 sailors on the raft wished the 5 others luck and let go to allow the rafts to drift apart, and the 5 to safely paddle ashore. Those 3 brave men were never to be seen again. During the evacuation of the flagship Delphi, she had suffered 3 losses. One man had bravely jumped overboard to save several of his shipmates, who had fallen overboard into the foamy surf. In doing so, his eyeglasses were broken and shards of glass had blinded him. He sputtered and floundered, blind in the oil-covered sea, before finally he was pulled aboard. But the man thrashed about in agonizing pain, a danger to himself and others. Slick with oil and in excruciating pain, he was in no condition to climb across the ropes to shore. So, he was tied to the mast for his own safety until he could be rescued the next day. He perished in the night as the Delphi broke apart and slipped beneath the waves. By midnight, the crews of 5 destroyers had made it onto the large flat mesa overlooking Honda Point. The cities of Santa Barbara, Lompoc, San Luis Obispo, and Surf had turned out in massive numbers to provide doctors, medical supplies, food, blankets, and most importantly, hot coffee to the 500 sailors on the shore. Trains ran through the night bringing in supplies and bringing out the more seriously injured sailors. By the morning, every one of the 500 men were on a train to either a hospital or south to the destroyer base in San Diego. Yet all 7 destroyers were deemed a total loss, and were left to be chewed up by the devil's jaw that was Honda Point. Miraculously, only 23 sailors lost their lives that night. Either by great skill or divine intervention, the greatest peacetime loss of ships in the US Navy was also one of the least lethal. A massive court-martial was convened by the Navy, and 11 officers were tried, the largest court-martial in US naval history. The court-martial cited negligence on the act of the officers and culpable inefficiency to perform one's duties, citing the negligence on Captain Watson's part to safely navigate his fleet. The captain was stripped of his authority, but all the other officers were acquitted. In fact, the captain was also recommended for accommodation, because instead of listing the numerous reasons for error, he owned up, taking full responsibility for the incident. At no point in the moments following the collision did he shirk his duties or lay blame. He took charge of his ship's company and fleet and made great efforts in saving his many men. In truth, he had likely kept that death toll to the small number that it had been. Honda Point, the Devil's Jaws, had had its meal, satisfying itself with a hearty feast of 7 shiny new Navy destroyers. But thankfully on that foggy September day, it had taken a mouthful of ship, but only a handful of sailing men's lives. Thanks for all the support I've been getting recently. My new channel is doing quite well, and it's thanks to folks like you. If you're interested at all in the Honda Point disaster and you'd like to learn a little bit more, I recommend reading Tragedy at Honda by Charles A. Lockwood. No, I'm not sponsored by it, but a great bit of my research was done with this book, and it's got a lot of really useful information. So if you'd like to, go ahead and check it out. I got mine from Amazon.com. You can probably do that or get it from a similar bookstore. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching the videos. Please stay tuned, and if you like what you see, go ahead and give the video a like and maybe subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much, and fair winds and following seas to you, shipmates.